In London, much of Marion's job consisted of receiving film from the field photographers in the European theater of operations, that is, the war in Europe. And when these films came in and were developed, some of them were dramatic, some of them were traumatic as well, for they showed not only the dead bodies as well as the recreational activities of our troops in the rear area, but some of them also showed pictures taken at the newly liberated concentration camps across Europe. From D-Day to Berlin, it was a dramatic experience, not only for those who were on the front lines, living it or dying in it, but also for all of those who were in the rear echelons doing their jobs to put the pieces together, understand the war, hopefully, and to bring some photographs and stories of it to the Western public, the United States, the British Isles, Belgium, and later, after it had been liberated, France. When my mother and I said goodbye before she went overseas, I was 8 years old. I was left to live with her mother, Grandma Tulsi, in Florida, sometimes with my father, my parents were divorced, sometimes with my father's parents and his sister, my Aunt Benatti, and occasionally even with extended family, good friends, usually someone who had a child about my age that I could enjoy, whose company I could enjoy. When my mother left me, while we hugged goodbye, she was saying it'll only be for about 6 months. That turned out to be over-optimistic. It was about a little over 2 years before I saw her again. And then, rather than her returning to the United States, or having me join her in London, as we had thought it would be, I rejoined her in Berlin, Germany, where she was by then an official of the United States government, the United States occupation government of Germany, holding the equivalent rank of Brigadier General as a CAF-14. Once again, she was breaking trail in a man's world, for no woman had ever been any higher than that. Marion made a habit of blazing a trail for the women who would follow. She never thought of herself as a women's libber or a feminist. She just thought of herself as a person who should not be penalized for her gender, but rather should be appreciated and rewarded in a way that was commensurate with her own talents and abilities. She was very talented. She was a great writer, and she had a good head on her shoulders when it came to recognizing a public relations disaster in the making or a public relations opportunity presenting itself. My mother and I were close. She was a loving mother and managed to give me that feeling of love even when she wasn't with me. She told me everything. Now, I can't honestly say that she sat down and told me her life story, one piece at a time. It's just that over the years we talked about anything and everything. When I was a little girl and she was far away, we wrote letters to each other, and we always put in the letter a line from our song, "I'll Be Loving You Always." When we got back together again in Berlin in 1946, after an absence of more than 2 years, I was 10 years old instead of 8. And I didn't realize until I grew up what a challenge that must have been for my mother to adapt to the fact that her little girl wasn't quite as little as she had been when last seen. When Grandma Tulsi and I left to go back to America with our 3 Pekingese in tow that we were taking home with us, and all our household goods having been shipped home to Gulfport, Florida ahead of us, at that time Marion was engaged to Faisal Ard. He was from Damascus. They were planning to marry, and when she let her contract lapse with the Office of Military Government, U.S., she and Faisal took a tour around Europe, particularly the Mediterranean and then the Middle East, and she went to Damascus to meet his parents. Alas, it was another broken romance, so I never did get to go to Damascus to join them, nor was I enrolled in the American school in Beirut, Lebanon, which was considered in those days to be, quote, a safe place, unquote, for me. Safe in that the Arab-Israeli war was raging in Jerusalem and nearby Damascus. But in any case, it was another broken romance, and Marion went back to Berlin with a new job for a new beginning. One of the things she taught me early on was that I had no right to look down on others simply because they were born into a different race or because they went to a different church. After we returned to America in 1953, my mother became involved to some degree in the civil rights movement. She joined the Congress of Racial Equality early on, before CORE got to be known, and when Martin Luther King Jr. made his famous speech, "I Had a Dream," in Washington, D.C., before 100,000 people, my mother was there and heard him speak. She was a great believer in equality. Many people may remember my mother as a reporter, Marion Peck, for the Chattanooga Times from 1953 to 1965. And during that time, she covered what was called the social services beat. And she was a strong advocate in her articles for the downtrodden, the disadvantaged, the disabled. She won a reporter's award for a story on architectural barriers to the handicapped. And I remember a photograph of a man in a wheelchair at the foot of a long flight of stairs that illustrated the difficulty people who have orthopedic handicaps have in getting around in public buildings. We look at her legacy now in the American Disabilities Act, and we look at her legacy in the ramps, the handicap placards on vehicles, and I think she had no way of knowing that even some members of her own family would have arthritis and would need those disabled tags on cars.